Great. Now, I will be leading us in a vote for acting chair. Does anyone on the BERDO Review Board would anyone like to make a nomination for acting chair?
I'd like to nominate Stephen Ellis for acting chair.
Thank you, Board Member Jacobs. Is there a second?
Second.
Awesome. Thank you, Board Member Nelson. Now I will lead us in a vote. So how do you vote for the motion of Board Member Ellis serving as acting chair? Board Member Ellis.
Aye.
Board Member Faruqi.
Aye.
Board Member Jacobs.
Aye.
Board Member Lattimore.
Aye.
And Board Member Nelson.
In favor.
Great. I will now hand the meeting over to Board Member Ellis and share my screen.
All right. Thank you, Diana. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I am calling this public hearing to order at 4:34 p.m. in accordance with the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure regulations adopted pursuant to the Building Emissions Reduction Disclosure Ordinance, Boston City Code Ordinance Section 7-2.2. The BERDO Review Board will hold a virtual public hearing at 4:30 p.m. on July 8th to review the following topics in regards to the reduction of greenhouse gases from the building energy production and consumption so as to promote the public health and welfare of Boston residents. In accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we are conducting this public meeting online. To ensure public access to the deliberations of the BERDO Review Board, the public may access this call through telephone and video conferencing. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment. To do so, please raise your hand or in the chat or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, send your questions to staff via email at berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. For the record, I am Stephen Ellis, acting chair of the board. I will now conduct a roll call of board members. Board members, please say your name in the order that they appear on the slide. Stephen Ellis.
Hassan Faruqi.
Lavette Jacobs.
Gail Lattimore.
Jack Nelson.
The staff will now introduce themselves.
Diana Vasquez, BERDO Review Board Manager.
Ziggy Chin, BERDO Review Board Assistant.
Here is the agenda for today's meeting. We will start with the approval of meeting minutes. The Environment Department staff will present administrative updates. After that, RDH will be kicking off session 2 of training for the BERDO Review Board. Finally, we'll adjourn. On the first on the agenda is to approve the previous meeting minutes from June 24th. Are there any questions or comments regarding the meeting minutes? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
On the motion to approve the meeting minutes, board members in favor say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Board members abstained say abstained. I believe the ayes have it. The motion passes. Now we'll cover administrative updates. Ziggy and Diana.
Hello. So we have some good news. Hassan was sworn in on Friday and now is an official member of the review board. We're very happy to have him as we get ready to review applications for the different flexibility measures. In regards to filling the vacant review board seats, we're still waiting for guidance from the mayor's office, but hopefully the process will start soon. We also have an upgrade on the Building Decarbonization Advisor Program. The request for proposal has gone live today, and the deadline for bids for the RFP is August 15th. And the Commercial Real Estate Working Group has an upcoming meeting scheduled for July 15th, where Eversource is planning on presenting to members. We are currently working on confirming completeness for the application submitted. If completeness cannot be determined for the applications, we will be foregoing our July 22nd meeting.
I can add some additional context on the last bit that Ziggy just mentioned on applications. So some good news, we have received applications. So in total, we have received applications for different flexibility measures. We've received 1 application for a building portfolio and 7 applications for hardship compliance plans. As a reminder, July 1st was the deadline for long-term hardship compliance plans. So we have received 7 applications for that. So as a reminder of some of the next steps, the BERDO team, so us at the city, have been reviewing the applications, just checking for completeness. We've been doing, just a check of all the applications, making sure all the questions were answered. If we find anything is incomplete, we reach out to the applicant and give them a chance, highlight or really specify what's missing and give them a chance to remedy that, fix it, fix their application anyways, and then they can resubmit it again, and then we'll go from there. Once we find that an application is complete, the BERDO team will add the applications to a future agenda. Our plan right now is to also give review board members 2 weeks to look at applications. So I know typically we've been sending items the Friday before a meeting. We recognize that that is not a mentally healthy way to review applications. So we're trying to give review board members 2 weeks for reviewing applications, and we will be including cover pages on that. So we haven't shared these cover pages before, but the idea being that you'll receive the full PDF of the application, but on the cover page, you'll get a summary. So who the applicant is, what they're applying for, just highlighting some of the key pieces. And then you can really dig deep into the details with the PDF itself. And we will also be sharing project evaluation sheets. So each individual board member will receive their own individual evaluation sheet. And on the evaluation sheet, there will be different processes or steps just to remind folks what type of applications can you request a hearing for, which applications must have a hearing, which applications allow you to include standard conditions or allow for special conditions, just to help kind of guide the review board members in their individual evaluations of each application type. And then at a public hearing, the review board will vote on the applications themselves. So your evaluation sheet is just yours for your individual note taking. It is not until at the hearing that you will speak with the other board members and make a vote for how you would like that application to go. So whether you want to approve with standard conditions, approve with special conditions, or ask for more information, etc. And I also wanted to give a reminder of the timeline. So for the building portfolio application, within 14 days of an owner submitting an application, the Environment Department, sorry, I should say this is for Pathway 1, which is what the application was that we received this for. Within 14 days from the submission, the Environment Department can confirm that the application is complete. So we're currently in this part of the timeline. Once we receive the complete application, we will notify the review board members. And then for hardship compliance plans, we have a little bit of more cushion or leeway. Once an owner submits an application, within 45 days from that submission, the Environment Department can confirm that the application is complete. So we're in that section of the timeline right now, but once we have complete applications, we will notify the review board as soon as possible. And then I know very briefly, there was a request to share just briefly what the cover pages look like. So I just wanted to very quickly share a preview. The cover pages are pretty straightforward, but they have an application name, building owner name, applicant name, date submitted, and then a link to the folder that will have the PDFs in it. It'll say which pathway, if it's building portfolio, what type of same owner. So in the regulations, there are different ways to select the same owner. Ensuring that they meet the eligibility criteria, so have their information been third-party verified during the last verification year, information for each of the individual buildings. If there is a need for example, the EJ maps, if they trigger that need to submit the 4 maps, we'll include that in here as well. So you can see it's a lot of information, and then finally staff comments and any staff recommendations. but hopefully the goal is that it summarizes the application in a quick, succinct way. And then, of course, if you want to dig deeper into the details, you can click the PDF and see all of that as well. And then very quickly, I'll just very quickly do a very quick preview of an evaluation sheet. And so similarly, these have links to the ordinance, the regulation, which type of application you would be evaluating, what's required from the review board, and what's optional for the review board. So for example, for pathway 2, the review board may hold a hearing to evaluate this application, but it's not necessary. So just kind of reminding folks of what their options are and the criteria that are listed out in the regulations. I recommend going in. There is a lot of information in there, so I apologize in advance that it's a little lengthy, but I think it'll help clarify the process a bit. And then finally, what your decisions are, what decisions you can make. So you could say, I would want to approve with standard conditions, approve with special conditions, noting that this would require notifying an owner 30 days in advance. You could vote to deny an application, or you could say you need more information. And then I list out what standard conditions means and then what special conditions you could include. So each type of application has their own different evaluation sheet, but hopefully this is clarifying what we mean when we say this. Yeah, and that's it for me. So I'll hand it over back to you, Board Member Ellis.
Thank you, Diana. I will now ask each board member if they have any questions or comment. Seeing as I'm first, I'm going to go ahead and ask my question or provide my comments. Thank you for showing us the cover sheet as well as the review form. I just want to get a point of clarification here in terms of what you're recommending in terms of how the review board can go about this process. Are you suggesting that we focus more so on the cover page, or and what I mean by that is that all the environment department will be providing us, or is it the cover page along with the entire application itself? That's my first question.
The latter. So the cover page will just be the first page, but the entire application will also be included.
Not a problem. That sounds great. In addition, I know you mentioned sort of like a 2-week time period. So what happens if you don't get enough responses from the review board?
So you don't have to send your evaluation sheets to us. They're really mostly for your individual, like note taking. If let's say, a review board member is like, actually, I need more time, just let us know and we can, as long as we're in the timeline that's set out in that flow chart, because we do need to follow that timeline, we can provide some flexibility there, noting that there is like a hard, within 30 days or within 45 days, there needs to be a scheduled hearing. So let us know if 2 weeks doesn't work, because this is our first time doing this and we're open to feedback. So if it turns out, you need more time than that, I think we're amenable to that.
Okay, very well. That sounds great. And the last thing I'll just provide as a comment or confirmation, I believe when you and I were talking before, I'm not sure if you said it or maybe I just missed it, but if ever the board members feel that some aspect of the cover page or some aspect of the review form needs to be updated, I trust that that'd be a seamless process essentially.
Yes, definitely. So we consider this a version 1 because we imagine that there will be many iterations as we learn. Maybe some of the information is superfluous and actually not that helpful, but there's other information that's missing. We're definitely open to different iterations and kind of seeing it as a living document as we, learn as we go.
All right, thank you, Diana. And first off, welcome, board member Faruqi. And now I will turn it over to you. Do you have any questions or comments?
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And my question is actually about the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, if we have gotten any applications for that since the last meeting.
No, we have, well, I could check right now, but since this morning, no. The deadline, as a reminder to folks also in the general audience or who have joined us, the application deadline was extended to July 31st. So originally it was mid-July, but it's been extended to the end of the month. And I imagine folks are maybe taking advantage of the extra time. So no submitted applications yet.
All right, great. Thanks so much. No further questions from me right now.
Thank you, board member Faruqi. Over to you, board member Jacobs.
No questions at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, board member Jacobs. Board member Lattimore, any questions or comments?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Diana, yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at all the materials for today, but did look at the applications, at least part of the applications. I wondered, I know from that there was a question that one of my CDC peers put to the city about, and now I'm talking about the Equitable Emissions Fund, about potentially collaborative proposals, meaning more than one owner submitting together for funding. And so I wasn't aware that that was a model that the city was open to. And just when I looked at the application, it appeared the application seems to be asking very individualized, building specific, owner specific questions. So I'm just curious about, how the city's thinking about that, a joint, multiple owners, different, who own different properties, separate from each other, how you see that. Because I didn't realize that was something that would be looked favorably upon, and not that that's an issue. I just am curious about how the city sees the application flowing with that, and how you then kind of make sense of a collaborative proposal, given that the buildings are supposed to be, are owned by different owners.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we did receive a question about a possible like joint application.
Mhm.
So the project proposal, we're open to it being like a joint application if they're like, we want to use the money or the funding to decarbonize maybe different buildings that have different owners. We recommend that, you just outline that in your project proposal, make it very clear that that they're different owners, and that they're sort of be like a main applicant. So someone who's like the main point of contact that we can sort of exchange if we have any questions. Because when the city distributes funding, we do need to we prefer doing a direct deposit, and so it does require like sort of a main point of contact who is like the main applicant. But the project proposal itself is open to like, any combination of a project proposal that people would like to submit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just wondered, because I haven't had a chance to look at the detail at the application, but do you feel like the application has room for that kind of, as opposed to individualized? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think the Google form really benefits from having like a main point of contact, because we do ask for like contact information. But the project proposal itself, I think, is very flexible, and there's like some room for flexibility in
Okay.
the proposal draft itself.
Great. And you may have already done this, or it may already exist. I've been kind of out of pocket for most of June, so I'm back in place now. But just, for the purpose of the review board's review of different applications, do we have, and it may exist, but do we have like a matrix which describes everything, meaning not everything, but like, there's these different pathways, what the description of those pathways are as we start reviewing? Do you understand what I'm asking? Just kind of a cheat sheet for us to have, either a matrix that explains things, makes it easier for us to get through applications.
Yeah, totally. For the fund, we have that project evaluation form, and I can share, or maybe I can ask Ziggy to share the link in the chat. So for the fund, we have the project evaluation sheet that we share also with the public, so any potential applicant can also see what the evaluation criteria are. And then for the flexibility measures, really it's that evaluation sheet is kind of what we're thinking will be the cheat sheet. So kind of what the criteria are, and how the regulations spell out
Okay,
the different flexibility measures should be evaluated.
all right, I'll take a closer look at that. Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. Board Member Nelson.
I have no questions. Thank you.
All right, so I would like to check if there are any other further questions from the board before we turn it over to public comment. Very well. We will now open the meeting to public comment. As a reminder to members of the public, to provide public comment, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, Send your questions to staff via email at berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. Again, as a reminder, we are limiting questions to 3 minutes to ensure everyone has a chance to speak. We also ask members of the public to introduce themselves and their neighborhood. We will now wait to give members of the public the opportunity to provide comments. I did see one question in the chat there from David Hyman, and it looks like Ziggy, maybe you or Diana could be able to answer that question that David has presented in the chat.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David. I'm not sure I know which form you're referring to, but I don't know if you maybe want to come off mute and maybe I can answer. Or if you feel more comfortable, also maybe elaborating in the chat.
I suspect it may have been the cover page and the review form based on the time that the chat was sent. I don't know if that's something that you can post in the channel. Hopefully that is what David was looking for, Diana. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Okay, got it. Sure. We don't have a public facing version of that yet because it was really meant for the review board members. But maybe when we post the slide deck, we can make a public version.
Very well. Thank you, Diana. All right. I see another comment. Mark Capadonna, and I apologize if I pronounced your last name incorrectly, from Colonial Power Group Incorporated, wanted to ask the BERDO team to about a supply option for compliance.
Mark Capadona, Colonial. We work with the city of Boston on their municipal aggregation program, and we've been approached by a couple of different suppliers looking to create additionality. And I didn't know we help the energy manager, Chris Kramer, and Oliver pull together some of the, and I know that you're leaning on like the mass class ones as a 100% as a product that helps you with compliance, meaning your supply portion is that much cleaner. I was wondering if we've been approached if BERDO wanted to have a BERDO specific supply option through the aggregation that building owners could choose to say, hey, we're as green as we possibly can. And this would be true additionality, meaning it'd be some solar array or something like that built on behalf of the customers choosing this option. Just we've been approached and I said, I will ask the question. I don't know if I've read through the regs. I see that you do have some things on supply. So I thought I would just come and ask the question of the team and see if they had interest or it's just the wrong time or what have you.
Yeah, I can take that one if that's okay, Stephen.
Yes, please.
This is Hannah Payne. I'm the director of carbon neutrality. Very happy to talk through that option and if there might be something that would be BERDO eligible. I would also just note that the aggregation program, the Boston Community Choice Electricity option, is BERDO eligible. So the RECs that are purchased through that, building owners and account holders in buildings get credit for that, for their emissions compliance already, if they're in either the default rate or if they're opting up to grade 100. So it's definitely something that we are letting building owners know about, that they can choose BCCE. We have heard from a few folks that have really large loads that they're not able to enter into that. So an alternative option may be something that they are interested in, but I'd be happy to have a follow-up meeting with you to discuss further. And sorry, I'm almost home, so I can put my email in the chat in about 5 minutes after I get situated.
I will reach out to Hannah after, so we don't have to, bore everyone with supply
Great.
options. But Hannah, I'll reach out to you afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Are there any further discussions or questions from the public? Hearing none, I will now turn it over to RDH. So RDH will conduct
Sorry, Chair, if I might just interrupt really fast.
Sure.
Just one final reminder. I know Ziggy kind of said it really quickly, so I just wanted to flag it again. If we do not have applications ready to be reviewed by the second and fourth Monday, by the fourth Monday of July, we are proposing foregoing that BERDO review board hearing. So I just wanted to flag that for review board members. We may not have a second meeting in July as we wait to confirm all the completeness for applications. So that does mean that the review board may be evaluating equitable emission investment fund applications as well as applications for flexibility measures. So it is going to be potentially a busy August. But I just wanted to make sure that I know Ziggy said that, but just wanted to take a moment to say it again.
Thank you, Diana. And just so I'm getting my dates correct, so you're essentially saying that we may potentially not have a meeting on the 22nd, and the next meeting that would occur, I think, according to my calendar, would be August 12th. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so there'll be about a 3-week gap in between those two. All right, not a problem. Are there any questions or comments from the board regarding what Diana just stated? Okay, hearing none, I will now turn it over to RDH. RDH will conduct a basics of building science training. This is session 2, so I'll hand it over to RDH. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. It'll be just a moment here while we get set up. All right, can I get a thumbs up that you can hear me all right? Thumbs up in the chat. Our chat set up. Okay, thank you. That works great. And can everyone see my screen? Okay, I've got a bluish, greenish slide up. All right, I'm seeing some nods. Thank you. All right, so welcome board members, department, and members of the public. So today we're continuing with session 2 of the BERDO technical training series. So my name is Bailey Brown. I'm with RDH Building Science, and I have the pleasure of being your facilitator again today. Just as a reminder, our training session today is for educational and training purposes only. So we will be talking about general concepts and they might apply to some buildings or portfolios, but it's intended for education. So if you have any questions, we have 2 emails up on the screen for you today that you could potentially reach out to receive some support. The first email is my own up at the top, and the second is the email for the BERDO review board. So we welcome you to use those if you have any questions. A little bit about what to expect from today, similar to our last session, but today is a recorded public session, which will be available to the public as well as the slide deck after today's meeting. We do have many joining, as we have members of the public, some folks from RDH, as well as the board and the department, and we welcome you all, but we do remind you that the training today is geared toward the review board. So all of our questions and activities are primarily geared toward them, but we're happy to take questions and input from others as well. If you have a more direct question, you're always welcome to email the review board or myself at the same email addresses as listed on the previous slide. We will be using Zoom as our primary tool today. So hand raise, chat, mic on and off. Typical features, feel free to cam on and off camera as needed and appropriate, but we do recommend cameras on if possible for the best learning environment. We do want to encourage kind of an informal and collaborative effort today. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out. We do have some dedicated Q&A opportunities spread throughout our entire session today, so you can hold questions for then. If you've got a really burning question, feel free to drop it in the chat and we will make sure to get to it as soon as we possibly can. As I mentioned before, the recording and our slide deck from today will be made available to the public for reference. And there are some mentions of pre-work today. So we reached out to the review board in advance of this session and shared some pre-work resources around district energy systems and ASHRAE energy audits. And so if you had an opportunity to review those, board members, great. If not, it will not hinder your ability to participate today. And we encourage you to take a look at them after the session if possible. I apologize. I seem to have froze here. There we go. Okay. And as far as those joining us today from RDH, myself, obviously, Steve Kemp is returning. He was with us in session 1. We also welcome Anushka Singh with RDH, one of our technical specialists supporting BERDO efforts for RDH. So thank you, Steve and Anushka, for joining me today. As just a high-level overview of our training journey, we are still in phase 1. So July 8th today, we're meeting about primarily energy audits, the concept that every building needs a decarbonization plan. And we'll also be talking about some beyond the building concepts if we have time. So our primary focus will be around those audits and planning for decarbonization. And then if we can get to it, we'll start talking about some district energy system information, RECs, and PPAs. Next week, the review board members will also have the opportunity to do some small cohort training, which will be 45-minute sessions. We've already allocated review board members to those non-public sessions, and we begin planning for that. However, at the end of today's session, we will have another learner feedback survey similar to session 1, and we'll collect additional thoughts from you on what you might want to learn about or topics that you feel should be covered. All right, so a quick overview for session or phase 1 here. Phase 1 is really around building science and policy fundamentals. We're talking about energy audits, planning for decarbonization, general BERDO compliance methods and decision-making and how all of that comes together, as well as beyond the building topics like district energy systems, RECs, and PPAs, looking at how all of those come together in order to meet the goal of BERDO and the kind of zero overtime planning. Before we get into today's content, though, I'd like to take a look back on session 1. So session 1, we talked about how buildings function as a system and the various subsystems, including mechanical, enclosure, renewable energy systems, and those influencing interior and exterior environmental loads. We also categorized building-related emissions and discussed scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and how they pertain to building-specific emissions themselves. We also covered why different buildings have different emission targets. So some buildings, due to their operating schedules or space conditioning needs, or many other reasons, have different targets. And we did some reflection on why that might be. And we also covered the confounding factors that might influence the opportunity for a building or a specific portfolio to make energy improvements. Those confounding factors, we had many of them listed, but they included things like historic buildings, access for upgrades, maybe to the interior, exterior of the building, available space or sound limits. There's many others that we described. So before we get into new topics today, I'd just like to pause for any questions that arose for any of the board members since training 1, since our first session. And as you think of them, kind of reflect on it, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat here. And give everyone just a moment to do that. And while you consider that, one question that may have come up for some may have been how those confounding factors discussed could be identified in a proactive way to avoid considerations like tenant disruptions or available funds, perhaps. So that's one question that I anticipate might have come up, and we'll get to the answer today as we start to learn about the concepts of every building needing a decarbonization plan and how we might demonstrate that or the options for that through one or more paths to meeting those emission targets on a given schedule. Looks like we have a question from board member Lattimore.
Yes, thank you. I missed the June 10th session and I started listening to it. I haven't finished listening to the recording of the session, but I believe the any PowerPoint that went with that training is available on the city's website. Like this, is that
I
the
believe
case?
so. Diana, can you confirm if that's posted there?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
If it's helpful, I can include a link in the chat.
Great, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. There's one question in the chat here from David Hyman. Thank you, David. When does one use emission per square foot and when does one use total emissions? David, would you mind coming off chat to talk more about your question so that we can appropriately answer it? I think it might depend on your reference point.
Okay. Well, I see various, in the regulations or the rules, some discussion where it says, such and such kilograms or tons or whatever per square foot. And other times where it just says so and so many kilograms per se. I mean, I'm not looking at them now, so I can't tell you where is one used and where's the other, but I know each of them is used in different places, and I want to know where does one use one, where does one use the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. Steve, do you have some feedback for that one that you can share?
Yeah, I can provide some of that. So generally, when you and we call it normalizing per square foot, that allows you to compare one building to another. And so if especially within the same type of building. So if you want to compare one office to another office or not one residential building to another residential building, we typically report it in per square foot so that you can see how you're doing against your peers. And of course the targets, because the targets are for the entire classification of building types. So residential buildings have one target, office buildings have a different target. They're also in kilograms or pounds per square foot. But when you need to get your target, not only when you need to offset your emissions, more importantly, then that's going to be on your total emissions. So when you're trying to get to zero and trying to figure out how many RECs you need to buy, or how many renewable energy certificates you need to buy, or how much on-site generation you need to get to zero or get to your target, then you're going to start talking about the total emissions. Because if your building is 100,000 square feet versus 50,000 square feet, obviously 100,000 square feet usually uses more energy and has more emissions. Does that help?
Yeah. So one is intensity and the other is the overall
correct
issue you live in.
All right. Thank you, Steve. That was a great explanation. David, did we sufficiently answer your question today?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have to look at the regulations again, but I think if I read it now, I probably will say, oh, it's that one. If not, I'll get back to you.
All right. Sounds great. Yeah, feel free to email us if you still have a question. Chairman Ellis.
Yes, thank you. I just want to comment on what I heard, what I think I heard David asking. It sounds like he was asking more specifically about some things that were in the regulation per se. And so and Diana or Hannah, please feel free to correct me if I get this wrong, but there's a piece in the regulation where we talk about total emission, but that has to do more so with the individual compliance schedule. For the most part, it's the per square foot that is being discussed throughout the entire regulation. Diana?
Correct, A+. Absolute emissions or total emissions only come into play with respect to BERDO if you are applying or have an individual compliance schedule. Otherwise, it is per square foot, correct?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would, this is Hannah. I would just add that there may be cases where we are, as was discussed before, like when you're needing to purchase RECs or things like that, where you will need to convert to total emissions to understand your emissions compliance. And that is, I hope that it is detailed in the regulations and guidance when we're talking about emissions versus emissions intensity. And that is something that we can help clarify and make sure is really clear in our guidance documents too. So I would just offer that, David, if there are further questions or specific instances where you've felt confused about which one to be looking at, please reach out to our team and we can help clarify that. So you can reach out to BERDO Review Board at Bostock, we'll get back to you.
Thank you both.
All right, thanks all. Any other questions pertaining to session 1 before we move on? All right. There was a request to for us to share some feedback on, or share the feedback from the session 1 training. So in totality, we had 8 respondents from our session 1 trainee feedback that responded. And overall, we asked 3 questions to inform how we continue to develop the training to meet the board's needs. So our responses from the board were quite positive. This would include the board and department. Generally, they felt that the level and complexity was appropriate. Responses on the experience showed that training was a good length. The Q&A was a popular opportunity to engage and to have those learning needs met. And there was good feedback for overall engagements and encouraging those engagements in future sessions. There was also some recommendations for more case studies, which we've included in the discussion today. So thank you to everyone who replied to that survey at the very end. As a reminder, we'll have another one at the end of today's session that we ask you to please support. And that could be for the department, the review board, or public members. You're all welcome to respond. And we will continue to use that feedback as we develop training for the review board. All right, so let's jump into session 2 training. Overall, today we're going to look at the purpose and steps of around an energy audit and why rebuilding needs a decarbonization plan. We'll talk about what the attributes of a plan look like. And then depending on time availability, we hope to get into some discussion on district energy systems and also renewable energy credits and PPAs. So our level of kind of breadth and depth in these topics will vary based on the time that we have available, and also recognizing that we have some future training sessions ahead of us that we can also revisit these topics in greater detail or kind of move them off until we meet again in August and September. We also have the opportunity to meet in our small cohorts in the next few weeks to talk about these at any level. So we'll just jump right in for today and see how far we can get. But our first topic is every building needs a decarbonization plan. And so when we describe a plan, we're essentially talking about a building or portfolio specific plan for achieving that net zero emission by 2050. And in parallel with the emission reduction targets set by BERDO, or an alternative schedule or plan that could be put forth as a flexibility measure for approval. And so as we move into this topic, we're really focused on option 1, which is reducing the direct building emissions. We do have other options. So option 2, looking at that local renewable generation and energy, renewable energy purchases, which is where the topics of RECs and PPAs for today would fall. But right now we're really focused on the direct building emission reduction, which is classified as option 1 for our training. So in order to bring that information to you today, we'll be listening to a recording from one of my colleagues, Sarah Gray. So a principal and senior specialist with over 20 years of building science experience. Sarah's describing the steps needed to achieve what's called a retrofit roadmap in this video. This video is a section of snippets taken from a deep energy retrofit symposium that RDH delivered in 2022, but it has a lot of strong relevance to our topic today. And so we'll be kind of exploring some of these videos with Sarah, and I'll be pausing at different times to collect questions, and we'll have some discussion. So to kick things off, Sarah's first going to discuss the process for planning and developing a retrofit roadmap. And so we'll be pausing a few times, as I had mentioned, and I am just recognizing now that I may not have shared this appropriately to get the video or to get the audio to you. So I'm going to reshare for just a moment. My apologies. All right, can I get a quick thumbs up that you can see my screen again? Okay, thank you, Diana. Appreciate it. All right, so let's hear what Sarah has to say.
And as Monty said very demonstratively,
every building needs a plan. We can't wish away the regulations. We can't push back legally at all cost to thwart the efforts to reduce GHG emissions or improve our buildings. And in fact, we should really be embracing the opportunity to retrofit our buildings, and certainly to understand the types of projects, the type of retrofits, the type of reductions. We'll need to construct a plan. So today I'll dive into the details to give a framework, a context, some tips and tricks for moving through the retrofit planning process. This is a graphic that was expertly put together by the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I know we have some RMI folks on the line. Thanks so much for breaking this down. This is a timeline and a sort of a linear approach to conducting a retrofit plan. Step one is certainly the most important. We need to set the goal of the retrofit of our project or projects over time to get us to the retrofit reduction milestones or the 2050 net zero emissions overall target. So set some goals, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. Next, we'll talk about setting a baseline, understanding the base building performance. Then we can plan our efficiency projects in step 3, look around and understand our renewable resource and storage available either at the site or off-site. Procurement in terms of buying systems, installing systems, construction work that'll be happening at the existing building. And then after we implement the retrofit, doing some measurement and verification to track the progress of our reductions. So the first step we talked about are to identify potential retrofit goals. Those goals could be internal, based on site level, owner level, or investor level goals for reducing energy and greenhouse gas. Those could be external goals, or maybe even external sticks in terms of regulatory requirements. So from a building level, we may have goals centered around greenhouse gas reduction, energy efficiency improvements, reducing the EUI that Zach talked about, and certainly, hopefully, operations cost reductions. We also may have some spin-off effects to a retrofit that could be improving thermal comfort for occupants, both in commercial offices or residential. Indoor air quality improvement could certainly be a bonus and create the environment where tenants and residents would like to stay in your building longer. Finally, there may be opportunities to improve curb appeal, certainly by overcladding or replacing windows, which could impact and hopefully increase resale value of the property. There are some climate factors that Monty talked about earlier today. As part of a retrofit, we may want to build in fire or smoke mitigation measures. We may have the opportunity to conduct a seismic retrofit in those zones, and or flood mitigation measures. So once we talk about those goals, we want to document them. It can be in any format. You could have a Miro board, you could have the little 2" by 2" 3M sticky notes, you could have a document, you could have a graphic, a poster, etc. But writing down your goals so that all stakeholders understand what the outcomes are, it's important. These are some options for goals, and I'm by no means saying that you have to have all of these goals in every bucket or category, but these are ideas and options that we're hearing from our clients. The one thing that's missing from this list, and I purposely didn't want to put anything down, are the measurables. So increasing revenue by X%, reducing operational cost, or reducing greenhouse gas by X% or X kilograms equivalent carbon. It's important to put measurables against most or all of these goals so that there's something that can be measured and verified at the end, so that you know you're meeting not only your goals, but certainly those regulatory frameworks and BPS that Zach mentioned. So writing that strong retrofit goal statement out of that initial planning exercise, again, those goals could be something like, I want to be net zero carbon by 2040 or 2050, depending on your local jurisdiction. You could have an interim goal of 50% greenhouse reduction by 2030, just 8 years away, and then moving towards net zero carbon in 2040 or 2050. And you could put a big stake in the ground and take a big step forward. If you have a major retrofit starting soon, you could potentially achieve net zero carbon quite soon if you're taking a big, bold move in the near future. We work with some clients that haven't yet had these strong goal statements in mind, and that's okay. And many clients come to us and say, Sarah, why don't you show me the potentials for reduced energy consumption or reduced GHGs, and then show me the costs, what the construction cost would be for a light or medium or deep retrofit, and then I'll decide the goal. Well, I think that's okay for an initial planning process, but as we've seen and learned about already today, the ultimate goals are going to be deep retrofits, deep reductions, moving toward net zero. So it's okay to understand the context of some light, medium, or deep retrofits and their associated costs now, but I think the writing's on the wall. In some point in the pretty near future, we're going to be going deep. So it's good to have that as an end goal in mind.
All right, so Sarah set the stage for the need for every building needing a decarbonization plan and the benefits that those plans can bring. So now we'll hear from her again about the concepts called a retrofit roadmap. So this is essentially looking at a decarbonization plan. And so there could be various pathways that this leads to, but it's looking at that full building and developing that plan. So let's hear what she has to say.
And as Monty said very demonstratively,
apologies.
So Christy mentioned that we've developed a retrofit roadmap for our clients, and it's not a one-size-fits-all roadmap, but the process is very similar to that linear model that RMI has outlined, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of those steps today. As I mentioned, we like to start with a project scoping and goal setting session. Again, if you're really new to this process, that's okay. We can help work through the sticky note process of setting those goals, understand your financial motives, your financial situation at this point in time, discussing and capturing those goals so that we have a roadmap, and then we can determine the next steps for the planning and assessment phase. So that's one way to sort of educate, share, and collaborate before we dive deep into the project itself. Next up, we typically conduct some level of building condition assessment. In some cases, owners have had a recent building condition assessment report provided. We can do a desktop study of someone else's report and understand if there are any gaps, missing information, or areas for particular focus. If it's a very detailed BCA report, then it may be all that we need. Otherwise, we may be going to site to do some test cuts in the walls or the roof to understand insulation levels, detailing of any air barrier or vapor barrier that may be in those assemblies, looking at the windows, understanding glass type, glass thickness, all those kind of nerdy building science details. And then certainly understanding mechanical, electrical, and potentially plumbing systems in the building as well. All of the pieces that are using energy, reducing load, increasing load, opportunities that could be ripe for a retrofit.
All right, so Sarah here, she's just describing generally the start to an energy audit. So there was some pre-work for everyone today that talked about the various ASHRAE standard levels of audits as one option to inform a building retrofit plan. And so level 1 audits are generally no cost and low cost adjustments, typically looking at things like energy bills, possibly a brief site visit, but often looking at energy waste and kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities. Level 2 starts to look at no and low cost adjustments and possibly digging further into improvements that fold in energy efficient measures that align with financial planning and capital intensive energy saving opportunities. And then we kind of carry up to level 3 there, which is most aligned with more robust recommendations and financial analysis for major capital investments. So these audits look at monitoring, data collection, engineering analysis, much more in-depth kind of holistic look at all the building systems and the contributing factors to those emissions, as well as long-term planning. And most of that is aligned with the planning process that Sarah's kind of described here in that bigger picture perspective. So depending on the building's age and the general status of compliance with the emission limits, these audits can vary on level of intensity and are opportunities for a building owner to learn more about how they might improve their building and make decisions. I did want to acknowledge that we have a question in the chat from David. Thank you, David. It says, what if our development is already at or near the, for example, 2030 standard? Would that mean that we wouldn't need to worry or only need to worry a little about emission improvements until the next standard, and therefore make the shortest term plan an 11-year plan than a 6-year plan? David, that's a really great question, and that's something that a lot of buildings are going to be contending with. And there might be some varying opinions there, but generally the encouragement is to look at that long-term planning as soon as possible to make sure that the impacts of that planning are well managed and that the funding for that, those improvements that might need to be made, are available. So we can dig into that question a little bit more, David, if you still have questions to that, as we get closer to our case study that Steve is going to talk about. Are there any other questions from anyone on the review board before we move into more discussion about planning? All right. So now we'll hear from Sarah and what she has to say.
I'm actually going to jump in. Sorry.
Yes, Chairman Ellis, please.
Okay, no problem. I just wanted to ask, in your experience, first off, can you talk a little bit about carbon cost, particularly dollar per carbon unit, whatever unit the individual is using? And is it showing up more in retrofit conversations for you all? Because I know in my space that is a question, and having to
We are unable to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
How about now? Okay.
Yes.
The headphones died right in the middle of my question. I apologize. I was just saying that I'm seeing it come up more often, and essentially the price on carbon question, that the dollar amount that I've been using has been what is associated with the alternative compliance payment. But I'm more so wondering, is it coming up for you all, and how are you sort of dealing with that in the retrofit conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Steve, can I call on you, or possibly Anushka? Do either of you have more that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so my answer is from a jurisdiction that does have a price on carbon. We're at $80 a ton, headed to 170 by 2030. And some estimates, or some whispers, are saying it's going to head to 300 by 2050. And generally, most economic reports I've seen say it needs to be between $250 and $300 to create the economic and financial incentives to decarbonize the entire economy. So, but that's a policy tool. There's other policy tools. So I equate price on carbon like a sin tax on cigarettes. You make it more painful to use it, so hopefully someone chooses to do something else. But there are other mechanisms to create those financial incentives, not just carbon pricing. So ultimately, it's up to politicians to decide what's happening in your jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Chairman Ellis. All right. So this next session from Sarah is a bit lengthier, so I just wanted to give some warning for that. If you have questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand, and we could possibly take a pause. But this session, we'll talk more a bit about the planning. So let's hear what Sarah's got to tell us.
So once we understand the building, we can do sort of this engineering table that captures the current performance of the building envelope. We're looking at roofs, walls, windows, thermal bridging at balcony slabs, parking garage soffit that may be separating the basement of your building from an underground parking garage, and assigning thermal performance or R values for those pieces. This is just one snapshot for a building we recently looked at. And we can kind of turn that table of data into a more visually graphic, visually appealing graphic that shows the heat loss through the existing building envelope, typically in winter, where I'm at in Toronto, we're a heating dominated climate. So we look at the heat losses in the winter, and we can start to see the impact of good or bad thermal performance of existing systems on the overall heat loss. So we take the performance of the system and its face area around the building, and we can provide that heat loss calculation. In this pie chart that we see here, the operable windows and the balcony sliding doors are contributing basically 50% of the heat loss from the building envelope. So that may be a place to start taking a closer look at options for improvement, replacement, and retrofit. Next, we take the information that we've collected from those documents or our on-site review, and we baseline or benchmark the building. We take a look at the electricity and natural gas consumption over an annualized basis. It could be an average of many years worth of data. This particular building looks like it's in a heating dominated climate where we have more natural gas usage from October through April and May. We have a baseline of electricity use and that kind of peaks up a little bit in the summer when we run the air conditioners. So it's good just to see the trends and understand if there's any outliers in the data. From that, in a little bit of energy modeling work, we can then understand what the consumption and intensities are for this existing building. We can look at the greenhouse gas intensity, the total energy use intensity, and the TEDI, which is thermal energy demand intensity related to the heat losses through the building enclosure. So this shows us where we're at in a current snapshot. We can also kind of slice and dice and visually display the data in a different way. And again, using some energy modeling software, we can break down the energy use of the existing building by various sources. So natural gas heating in the red bar, natural gas hot water in the green bar, and the various electrical loads that we have to the left-hand side. And certainly because we have natural gas heating at the sample building, it takes up the most greenhouse gas intensity in the bar graph at the bottom. So it's showing us that if we want to reduce greenhouse gas intensity, we probably need to think about getting off natural gas. So this type of baselining is important not only to understand the breakdown of energy and greenhouse gas use, but to then be able to compare to averages, such as the InterCan survey of multi-unit residential buildings in the orange graph at the top, and then also local tiers of reduction strategy, in this case TGS, which is the Toronto Green Standard. Their tier 4 is a very high performance building with a low TUI and a low GHGI benchmark. So taking that data, we can start to look at systems and identify potential retrofits. Just a brief pause in terms of the retrofit language and some jargon, I guess. Energy conservation measures, or ECMs, are those that reduce the energy. So just reducing the number of kilowatts, reducing the number of joules, reducing the number of BTUs, probably without fuel switching or off the mark. Next, we have carbon reduction measures. So those are which are reducing the greenhouse gas intensity. So if we add insulation to our building envelope, we may need to use less heating, therefore reducing our carbon footprint. If we switch from natural gas or oil fuel, fossil fuel, to electricity that's on a cleaner grid, that would be a carbon reduction measure. And finally, we can have low carbon resilience measures, LRCMs, and those combine climate adaptation and climate mitigation measures. So those may also include, the flooding type mitigation, overheating. We may be adding shading devices to mitigate climate impacts, those sorts of things. So not everything has to have a reduction for energy and carbon. We can also think about how we're adapting or mitigating climate impacts. So from those sorts of pieces, we start to put them into different silos. Load reduction, as I mentioned, that can be reducing the need for heating and cooling by having a better performing building envelope, having better or more efficient energy systems that we'll talk about in a minute, the use of renewable energy to offset what we're taking from the grid, and finally, we can consider any carbon offsets for any remaining carbon intensity in the electricity grid. From there, we can be starting to think about carbon neutrality or net zero carbon. So putting a bit more detail into each of those buckets, what does it mean to reduce loads? Again, when we're reducing loads, we're typically improving the building envelope by adding insulation, improving windows, and air sealing the building, keeping that air inside the building. What are we talking about in terms of energy efficiency? LED lighting, higher levels of efficiency on heating and cooling systems, and having ventilation systems that have heat recovery on them. Decarbonizing gas heating is typically that fuel switch from a fossil fuel to a cleaner grid electricity. That can be a ground source heat system or heat pump. That could be an air source heat pump that both run on electricity. Renewable energy, we can have on-site PV on the roof or on-site PV panel cladding, on-site PV canopies over parking spaces or parkland. We could have on-site wind generation or off-site solar or wind generation. And by carbon offsets, we're typically talking about purchasing offsets in various ways that are available on the market. So understanding those buckets, then we can look at building enclosure system retrofit options. So that's kind of that first bucket in terms of load reduction. We can look at cladding systems where we're overcladding with an external insulated finish system, a clip and rail system, or some sort of panelized system. That could also include full cladding replacement, so not just putting insulation over the existing, but taking the existing off and putting on a new cladding system. And certainly with that, we have to think about the current wall condition and the structural capacity of the building. There are several options for windows. We could look at just keeping the existing windows and adding weather stripping and providing some better air seals, or we could think about switching to double or triple pane insulated glass units, potentially with thermally broken or even fiberglass frames. Roofing is typically a place where we can add insulation and provide some more durability and resilience. Some considerations along with adding insulation at the roof, you need to think about penthouse door heights and sills, the heights of the parapets and curbs, and potentially replacing roof anchors so that they have a longer stem that can accommodate thicker insulation. With either step, we're typically making the building envelope more airtight. So with building envelope projects, we also need to work hand in hand with the ventilation system to make sure that the interior is getting enough fresh air to maintain a healthy environment. In terms of mechanical systems, we mentioned heating and cooling systems, switching from fossil fuel based to electric systems, typically electric heat pumps that have a very high coefficient of performance or COP. That could include air to water heat pumps for buildings that currently have hydronic systems, or air source heat pumps or ground source, as I mentioned before. Fresh air supply and exhaust, we just mentioned, typically decoupling heating from fresh air so that we have a dedicated outdoor air supply system that can run 24/7, 365 to provide that good quality indoor environment. For domestic hot water systems, the lowest hanging fruit is to switch to low flow water fixtures, so we're simply using less domestic hot water. And then on the back end, we can look at wastewater, drain water heat recovery systems that are copper coils around pipes or a central tank that captures the heat to preheat fresh water going back to the system. So now that we have some options for both our building envelope and for our mechanical systems, we can put some of those measures together in combinations to analyze the outcomes. And this is a placemat graphic that we've provided to several of our clients that shows the light retrofit scenario to the left. You know, not a lot of GHG savings, but a good first step. And then moving rightward to the medium retrofit step and to a deep retrofit step. And this is just a snapshot to show how we've built up those projects with window, wall, cladding repairs, and also the mechanical systems. So we're not just pretty pictures. We typically like to provide data to our clients who are interested in various savings numbers, those measurables that I talked about, to see if those measurables are aligning with the goals and the regulatory frameworks that are set out at the beginning of the study. And as I mentioned before, deep retrofits with major renewal projects are typically going to be the only real option for implementation, or a final goalpost for implementation, when we're in a jurisdiction that is going to be moving toward a net zero carbon mandate. So we can align and show the existing baseline, medium, and deep retrofits. And then we've developed this graph where we plot greenhouse gas intensity versus the energy use intensity. So looking at the existing building where it's at and how we move down into the left with subsequent retrofit measures. Certainly we'd like to be at the green zone in the end. So very low energy use and very low carbon intensity. We can look at the breakdowns again, benchmarking against the existing building, looking at the medium and deep retrofit scenarios for both energy use intensity and greenhouse gas. So lots of charts and graphs, but again, looking at numbers and measurables. And these are based on the energy model outputs and inputs that we provide on these combination of energy conservation measures and or carbon reduction measures. So what about timing? Well, we can look at our building and understand if there is an upcoming trigger event that could start the deep retrofit process, such as a window replacement. Many of the towers in Toronto were built in the 70s and 80s, and if they haven't yet had their windows replaced, those windows are probably coming due for replacement in the near future. That trigger event of replacing the windows could also start some other things in place, such as overcladding. How are we going to detail a new cladding around the windows? And if we replace windows and cladding, we're more airtight, so we may need to think about bringing in fresh air as part of a bundled package of repairs. If we don't have a trigger event coming soon at the building level, is there a trigger event at the local jurisdictional level, such as Boston and Denver, which we just spoke about? Does the local government have a mandate for deep retrofit or net zero carbon goals fairly soon, or what are the timelines, and how can we align the plan at the building level to the external timelines that will be mandated? Or if none of those apply, what's the owner's goal for getting to zero? What are investors' goals for getting to zero? So it's this ecosystem of timeframes and trigger events that can help slot in plans over time. So we could have immediate retrofits coming online such that there's funding available now. We have an immediate trigger event such as windows or cladding needs. Those scopes and the projects are plan design either now or in the very near future. You're kind of ready to go. We can certainly defer some or all of the retrofit projects if there's not a looming trigger event in the near future. You may need to build up some funds. You may be waiting for the end of service life for some of the systems. But just because you're deferring the projects doesn't mean that you need to defer the plan. Planning now is a great way to understand the map forward and getting projects in place, funding in place, code and permit situations sorted out, so that when that trigger event happens in the near future or medium term, you're ready to go. You have that plan, you're ready to implement it. There's also the retrofit over time, which Rocky Mountain Institute is a great proponent of. There's zero overtime project, where we know that we may replace the windows now, the cladding 5 years down the road, the boilers are going to get switched over to heat pumps in maybe 10 years or so. So we have this overtime retrofit, and we have that final go post at 2040 or 2050, where we'll be at net zero carbon emissions. What does that look like graphically? Well, on the left, we have the current year, or year one, where we've plotted the existing building performance. And with each subsequent retrofit project that's being implemented, we reduce our energy use intensity and or our greenhouse gas intensity. This is just a sample for a particular building. There could be two pathways. This particular building wanted to study what would happen if we could get to 50% GHG reduction by the year 2030. So here's showing the pathway in blue, where the blue line downward cuts GHG emission by 50% by the year 2030. And then further in time, as we march forward in 2050, we're getting to a very low GHG or net zero carbon situation for this building. So again, it doesn't have to be immediate. This is illustrating an overtime approach which spreads projects and disruption out. This is the tool that RDH has kind of adapted from the Interfit Scheduler tool, sorry, it's a mouthful, so that we can show a more calendar or tabular approach to this. It's starting to look like a capital plan or a CapEx plan for those of you in the commercial industry, where we start the timeline of the building's original construction, in this case 1970, and we plot out the green line that shows the early service life of that system, in this case the exterior walls. We know that we'll probably be doing repairs over the lifetime of the walls, that's the yellow bar. And then the end of service life is when we can start to plan the overcladding, the recladding, the retrofit of that system. In some cases, we may replace, in this case, windows or doors before the end of the service life if the timing and or logistics of that particular site align, or if we need to make bigger cuts faster to achieve particular goals. So it's great to plot this out in terms of timeline, and hopefully most of our replacements will be in the yellow or the red service life renewal stage. We can see the costs and the type of reduction on the right-hand side. So just to touch on a few other retrofit considerations beyond standard wall cladding, window replacement, boiler switch outs that we would recommend that you include in your plan or discuss with your stakeholders as you develop the plans. Our first goal for developing plans is really thinking about sequencing, or what my colleague Maureen says, no undo redo. So thinking about what projects should be implemented first, second, third, fourth, and last. Sharing that draft retrofit plan with your internal stakeholders, maintenance contractors, consultants, or even an external peer reviewer to say, does this plan make sense? Are we doing these projects in the right order, the right combination, or do we need to switch a few things around for constructability reasons, better performance reasons, building science reasons, that sort of thing. When we're talking about fuel switching from primarily natural gas to electric heating systems, we need to understand the building's electrical system capacity. Many of our buildings are over capacity at this point because we've got 1 million computers and 1 million TVs and all these electrical systems running that weren't in existence when the building was originally built. So if we're moving to electric heat pumps or we're adding cooling or other ventilation systems, we may further tax that electrical system. So engaging an electrical engineer, electrical contractor specialist to look at the existing service feeds, transformers, switchgear, panels, to check what type of capacity may need to be added or fully replaced as part of the retrofit plan. Some code and accessibility triggers will be a result of a major retrofit, upgrade, or adaptation project. So that could mean upgrading fire suppression systems, adding or improving fire separations. When you open a wall for cladding, you might find that there's no fire separation, so that will need to be built into the plan and into the projects. And particularly if we're closing off balconies or enclosing balconies, there may be impacts to existing exiting paths and distances that would need to be somehow mitigated as part of the overall building strategy. And there's no good existing buildings project that doesn't have a few hazardous materials along the way. So having those environmental reports conducted soon is a great idea. That way we know what type of abatement will need to be handled as part of any drywall repairs, duct pipe replacements, removal of window seals that may have asbestos in those older materials. And certainly thinking about impacts to residents and tenants. And the key thing here is to communicate, talk to residents and tenants about your plans to implement retrofit projects, what that means to them on their day-to-day life or work situation, but also the opportunity that the retrofit project may present in terms of better thermal comfort, better quality of indoor air, those sorts of things. Town halls, emails, or newsletters are great. My colleagues Mike and Tammy will be speaking about this in a couple more sessions this afternoon. So I want to touch a bit on retrofit planning for portfolios. All of the processes that I just talked about are tending to be implemented at the single building level at this point, but we're starting to think bigger. And although we may have these steps for a single building, the RMI 6-step process also applies to portfolios. But again, we're just scaling up and grouping buildings together, or looking at an investor's portfolio across their scope. So how do we go about that? What are the details, steps for looking at the portfolio? Well, certainly opening up your portfolio list or your tool. You may have a capital expenditure program, you may have a spreadsheet, you may have some sort of asset management system. Provide that to your team of consultants that are working with you on developing the retrofit plans. I'm sure there's a lot of great detail in the information that you already have. You'll want to identify which buildings you have pegged as a long-term hold strategy that you may want to spend more time and effort on, versus those buildings in your portfolio that may be shorter term. So, you know, if you're going to sell off a building, maybe it's a strategy not to implement retrofit projects, or it may be the opposite. You may want to put a little time, effort, and money onto short-term hold buildings so that you can increase the market value, the market cap on those particular pieces in your portfolio. Again, across the portfolio, looking at age, you may not need to look at the 5-year-old buildings now, but certainly be looking at the 50-year-old buildings, looking at energy systems. Do some or all of your buildings have fossil fuel-based systems, or are some electric? There may be other opportunity tags that are particular to your portfolio. You could group buildings for retrofit planning by geographic location, or you could group projects by trigger point timing. If you have a portfolio of 30-year-old buildings and all of them are coming due for window replacement, that may be an interesting way to leverage some efficiency or economies of scale. And finally, you can develop individual plans, campus level plans, or portfolio level kind of archetype plans across your holdings.
All right, so we'll pause there for a moment. The next topic that Sarah talks about in this planning discussion is around some of the tools that are available, which there was a question in the chat about. So we'll have some discussion after that. We do have just a short segment left from Sarah's discussion here. And so we'll go ahead and play that, and then we'll have some larger discussion around how this applies to general compliance for BERDO buildings, and get to some of these questions. And Board Member Lattimore, I see that you have to go. Thank you for joining us today. I believe it was your question around the tools, and so we'll do our best to get that answer to you regardless.
Thank you, and I will also listen to the rest of the recording. Sorry, I have to go into another board meeting.
No problem.
Good night,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
In summary, every building needs a plan. It seems like a daunting process. You have a portfolio of 50 or more buildings. You have buildings that have a lot of repair need. How do we get started? It's sort of that headache that makes your head spin. But again, if you take the step-by-step process of jumping in, understanding the building, understanding the archetype buildings within your portfolio, you can start to parse down the projects and reductions that would be benefited from those retrofit projects.
All right, so that was a great discussion from Sarah. So let's talk a little bit around how this all comes together for BERDO and the review board's purview. So as we think about that, I'd like to welcome anyone who would like to come off mute to share their perspective on the next question. That being, what compliance options do you think energy audits and building decarbonization plans may inform? You can drop it in the chat or feel free to come off mute. Just curious of your thoughts here. While you consider the options, one option that might come to mind is the flexibility measures, right? Looking at alternative compliance schedules to demonstrate achieving that net zero emissions by 2050, but possibly waiting for a period to implement retrofit measures. So Sarah talked about those trigger events. You know, if you know that there's an upgrade that needs to occur, how can you fold that into your plan and still achieve the overall goal by 2050? Another is possibly hardship compliance plans. There may need to be some sort of overall plan and well kind of thought out process and the clear team in order to demonstrate the potential for that to be successful. Are there any other thoughts on how building decarbonization planning and retrofit planning might fall into these different categories, why it might be helpful? All right. Steve, can we circle back on board member Latimore's question? There's a really great question in here, if I can find it. It says, what energy modeling software is common? Are there numerous options? How about software that takes all the data into consideration and generates options impacts for a given retrofit factor? Is there software that does that as well?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the software. First, there's quite a lot of software available. Two most common ones are developed by the U.S. Department of Energy and are free. So free to use. The older one is called eQuest. It runs off something called the DOE engine, Department of Energy 2.1, actually 2.2 now engine. And the newer one is called Energy Plus. So these are two free options. Then there are pay for options, and there's probably 3, 4, 5 of those. IES Studio is one. Train Trace is another one. Carrier HAP is another one. A lot of mechanical design firms are already using Carrier or HAP to design and size equipment in their buildings, or Train Trace to size equipment in their buildings, so they can be leveraged to turn into hourly whole year energy models. And hourly is kind of the key point of all those tools. They kind of march the building through the year with all the assumptions you put in it. So you, the user, have to 10,000 inputs is not an exaggeration to define the building performance. The full geometry of the building is in there. The performance of all the envelope elements are in there, what direction they're facing. So how much sun impacts the roof or the window, most importantly, the windows. What's the performance of the windows? Human behavior assumptions are in there. How many hot showers do you have a day in a residential building? How often do you fill the tub? How long are the lights on? Most buildings that the lights are on a schedule, but when you get in the residential buildings, you have to build these assumptions in. Which is all to say, you can model almost anything, but it's not like it's a button that says A, B, or C. You, the user, have to work with the building designers, architects, engineers to understand the concepts of what they're trying to implement, and then turn that into something the software can understand and give you a reasonable answer.
Awesome. Great, Steve. Thank you for that. Very helpful. Are there any other questions before we move on to a case study that demonstrates how to fold all this together? All right, I'm not seeing any. Steve, thank you. Hassan, board member Faruqi, what's your question?
Yes, I recognize the cost of this will be very, very different for different buildings, but do you have a ballpark of what the market rate would be for a retrofit plan for an individual building, just in terms of like hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, et cetera?
Tens of thousands. I mean, a level 1 energy audit is $5,000 to $8,000. That's not a very deep dive, but it'll tell you, boy, you really should replace those light bulbs. They're really old. Have you heard of LEDs? And it might actually find you some other low-hanging fruit around heat recovery and other things. Your windows are clearly old and leaking. And there's ice building up on the inside. You could replace those. But at the level 2 and level 3 energy audit, you can get into $50,000, $150,000, $200,000. And it comes down to how detailed a plan do you want. It's easy for someone at a desktop to come up with ideas and say, you can do these 5 things, but they never visited the building to figure out, can you do choice number 3X? Like, what does that actually involve? Is there space to put equipment in? What does the construction actually look like? So those tend to get into the high end, where we actually put together a real plan, maybe not produce drawings, but start understanding, is this implementable? How will it go? Where does this stuff fit? It runs the gamut.
Great response. There's a note in the chat here around opportunities to work with Mass Save to look at kind of those elementary audit levels for free. So thank you for that, David. All right, Steve, we have about 20 minutes to get into our case study. And then at that point, I believe we should break to do our learner survey and a few wrap-up materials. So I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Yeah, I'm going to try sharing on my screen to see if I can make it work.
Oh, I can stop sharing. One moment.
Yeah, I just realized. Where'd the share button go? Oh, there it is. Oh, I'm not allowed. Shoot. Okay, maybe you have to.
Let me share one moment. All right, the case study for the municipality building should be visible. Can everyone see that?
So to answer someone's question earlier, this is an example of the $100,000 option, maybe 150. So there was mechanical designers involved, electrical designers, cost consultants, and ourselves for the envelope and the energy modeling. So this is meant to be a fairly fleshed out plan. As Sarah mentioned earlier, first thing you have to decide is a goal. In this particular case, this is a administrative building for a municipality, and their goal was to get to zero carbon over time. Like, how do they do that? How do they align that with their business as usual end of life for different pieces of equipment? And sort of a little bit of a backstory as we go to the next slide, if you can advance. A little bit of a backstory is that when we were engaged, they were already replacing the windows. And so immediately we threw up our hands and say, please stop doing that. Maybe we want better windows, like, please stop. And then we ended up talking to their consultants and understood why they took the path they did. And we said, yeah, you made the best choice. Because it's going to come, and I'll show you why in a few more slides, but it comes down to what Sarah was talking about earlier, is that sequencing and how one thing impacts another. And we don't want to, what was the comment? No undue redos. I like that. That would have to come from Maureen. And so just like Sarah said, we always like to look at load reduction first. In this particular case, we only got a little bit of load reduction, and again, I'll explain why. Then we started looking at how to improve the carbon emissions and the efficiency of the heating and cooling systems. Then we looked at the renewable energies for them, and then getting to zero is going to involve them buying some carbon offsets or renewable energy credits. So next slide. So this was kind of our plan, to first understanding we looked at all the building drawings, we looked at all the building condition assessments, we understood what was the expected life of various building systems, how many more years are they expected to last before they inevitably need to be replaced. All buildings do need maintenance. A lot of conversations with the facility manager, his name was Dennis, trying to also understanding what issues they were having, what places that were they having issues with, were they having issues with comfort, were they having any issues with odors, all those things that we could wrap all those into a plan and improve not just energy and carbon, but the actual experience in the building. And then we broke out that hourly energy simulation to try to understand how the building was operating currently. And that involved calibration as well, trying to understand, get our inputs aligned in that model to what was actually happening in the building. And I'll show you those results in a bit. And then looking at those emissions, energy conservation measures and carbon reduction measures that Sarah talked about. What can we put together in what order that made the most sense? So not to, again, back to that sequencing thing. And then we did a full financial analysis for them. So this was the life cycle costing of all these options over those timelines to try to find them a path that they were comfortable with. Next slide. So this is that level 3 energy audit of the blue bars on both of these are the actual utility bills for their natural gas on the left, and the blue bars on the right graph. Again, the blue bars are their actually utility bills. And then the other color, the orange and the green, that's what came out of our energy model after going through a calibration process. So, you put all your inputs in and go, oh, wow, there's even less gas being used in July and August than we thought. You guys really don't use domestic hot water in this building. Well, it's an administrative building. There's no laundry happening. There's no dishwashing happening. There's no showers happening. And so we were able to tweak a few things and tweak a few of the schedules based on what we learned from the facility manager. To be clear, all models are wrong. The point is to get them to a position that they're useful. So they're never perfect, but we want to get them to a place that we can help them. They can be helpful for us to decide what to do and in what order to do things. Next slide. And then just like Sarah said, we wanted to sort of figure out where they are. So the nice colorful graph in the middle, second from the top actually, is their breakdown of their energy use. So lights, the plug loads, they had a small data center in the building. So the server, that's the next salmon color there. They had a little bit of electric resistance heating throughout the building, cooling, pumps, fans. The biggest one, of course, was natural gas for space heating. The top bar is just again, we wanted to put comparisons of where they are compared to the average administrative building. So they were doing better than average. They were happy to hear that. The bar in the middle, the third from the top, is where we think we can bring them to. This is total energy use intensity, so how much energy they're consuming. Again, normalized to an intensity so that we can get them compared to other buildings. And we pulled a couple other ones. There's a zero carbon building standard that people are using for new construction. We don't think we can quite get them to that one. It is an existing building. They're, insulating the slab is not going to be easy. So we couldn't pull every measure at them because it was an existing building. And now just to make them understand just how good you could be, that last bar at the bottom, that's passive house retrofit standard. So that's about the best we know, that most stringent standard that's out there. Next slide. The other thing we wanted to figure out is the thermal energy demand intensity. So yes, bring that up, that slide one more ahead there. And the thermal energy, so if the biggest energy user in the building was that natural gas for space heating, it's like, well, what's causing that? And how do you understand the breakdown of that? Because it's not just the boiler. It's all the things you lose the heat out of the building. So the very top graph where it says walls, roof, infiltration, windows, those are all the heat losses in the building. So if we heat our building in a cold climate, heat is leaking out the walls, it's leaking out the roof. It's leaking out through infiltration. This is just air flowing through our walls, our exterior walls, because they're not perfectly airtight. The windows, and of course, we have to bring fresh air into the building for air quality reasons. That's the ventilation. So the total of that is our total heat loss. And so the next bar, we get some free heat from stuff. We get some free heat from internal gains, from people, from running the computers. All of us are 100-watt light bulbs giving off heat to our environment. And so that's the orange and the dark and the blue at the far right of that graph. So that's our free heat, and the rest is what we call the thermal energy demand intensity. This is the mechanical heat we have to provide to the building to make these two bars equal, because they have to be equal. And so that starts giving us an idea of what do we really need to do to reduce that heating demand. Infiltration, a big one. Can we do weatherization, caulking, a little bit of spray foam here and there to seal up the holes in the building? And that's all low-cost stuff. It's someone running around with a caulking tube, finding all the air leaks in the building and patching them up. Definitely the windows are a significant one, and the ventilation is pretty significant. And then next two bars, so click ahead there, Bailey. The same thing. This is where we thought we could bring them to. We thought we could bring down your air leakage, put in better windows, improve the ventilation, put in heat recovery ventilators. So shrinking down the green, the yellow, and the light blue. And we still have the same solar gains. We still have the same internal gains, and that carbon, that heat, thermal energy demand intensity, able to cut it in half if we go through these measures. And so that's just giving you an idea of what the breakdowns look like. And again, a couple of benchmarks. The zero carbon building standard target is 32. Passive host retrofits target is 25. So we're not going to quite get to those numbers, but we can get pretty, we're on our way. Next slide. For the enclosure, this slide is really just trying to point out how important windows are to heat loss. So this graph aligns vertically. It's the R value of the wall and window system combined. Because we for some reason, we talk about walls and R values, and we talk about windows and U values. But a U value is just 1 over an R value. If your U value is 0.25, that means it's R4. Which means most windows are around R3, R4, and we stick them in R10, R15 walls. And we start saying, we got to add more insulation to the walls. I'm like, well, but most of the heat's going out the window because it's such a small or low value. And the existing building is where that X is in the middle there. It's about 40% glass, 60% opaque wall. And if you put the best windows in the world, you're going to raise your total building R value up to R6. So right there. I said that wrong. If we go all the way to an R30 wall, best we're going to do is an R6 building because we have these double glazed R3 windows. But if we can go to triple glazed windows and get into an R7 window, all of a sudden now we can bring the whole building R value up above 10, which is kind of where we'd like to be in a cold climate. So this is one of the things we were really wanting to look at, those existing windows that we were about to replace, and said, please don't put another double glazed window in there, put some triple glazed windows in there. But we ran into a problem. But again, I'll get to that. Next slide. And this is where we got into the problem. Yes, windows, as I said, the left side there, that's a thermal imaging camera. Basically, anything that's closer to yellow is where the heat loss is. Anything closer to blue is fairly well insulated. There's not a lot of heat loss. You can see definitely it's the windows that are causing the issues. A couple other, you can see some horizontal lines. That's thermal bridging in the opaque envelope. Bailey's really good at understanding what I'm talking about. You almost like you've done this before. So that's some thermal bridging, some metal, probably a piece of metal or something in the envelope that's letting a lot of heat through, bypassing the insulation. And on the right, top left, this is it's a cross section of the frame of the windows that were being used. And so that whole cross section, that's the frame. And you can see the horizontal pieces. There's a double glazed window in there. Yep, there we go. And on the right would be the triple glazed version of the same. And you can see we need a different frame to accommodate that triple glazed window. And so we're like, okay, fine, we can replace all the frames along with just the glass. Right now they're replacing the glass, so let's replace the frame and the glass. And then we looked at the drawings, and that's the bottom there. And the vertical frame members are disappearing behind the opaque wall. So for us to replace the frames to accommodate the triple glazed windows, we would have to pull off the entire wall system. And the entire wall system has another 30 years of life in it. So this is back to that sequencing challenge. You know, do we spend the money and we could upgrade the entire envelope with the windows, and do we do that now versus only putting in the better double glazed windows than they had before, and leaving the opaque walls as they are and replacing them 30 years from now when they will need to be replaced. So these were some of the choices that had to be made, and we can show you the cash flow for those two options in a couple more slides. Next slide. The opaque enclosure upgrade, you know, when it's due, which is going to be a number of years from now, would involve taking off the stone cladding, the stone veneer. It's a very thin veneer. It kind of shows better on the right. And then replacing that with more insulation, these clip systems that doesn't fully thermal bridge all the insulation, so we can get most of the insulating value out of that, and basically taking the current wall, which was installed at R15, but we're only getting R6 performance out of it because of thermal bridging. But taking that R15, that R6, and bringing it up to R16, even though we have about R40 with insulation there. So thermal bridging really retards your heat loss. It really impacts how much heat loss you have. So it's not always just about how much insulation you have, but how much metal stuff is sticking through the insulation. Basically, metal, aluminum, steel conducts heat 3,000 times faster than the insulation it displaces. So it doesn't take very much to really upset the apple cart. And you can see what's happening here, R40, but we get R16. Next slide. The other places we were looking at thermal bridging was in the parapets, where the roof met the wall. And you can see exactly where Bailey is indicating there's not a lot of insulation there. There's a lot of structural materials there. Structural materials conduct heat quite well. And so there's a lot of heat being lost out through that parapet. The bottom left is the recommendation of how to improve that. The day that, when the roof needs to be replaced. So that's looking at 2040, 2050 timeline based on the condition assessment of the building. And the other thing, the very top right image, this building had lots of really nice skylights in the roof, bringing lots of natural light. The next image right there, again, that's a thermal image, but it was done with those dome skylights you see. And you can see all the way out around the perimeter there, that was uninsulated. And so again, we have, an R40 roof, and, all these thermal bridges are all of a sudden degrading that R40 roof down to like an R15 roof. And so we were, part of the thing was the day the roof needs to be replaced, it will need to be replaced around 2040, 2050. We would, we didn't need any more insulation in the roof, but we would insulate around all those skylights per that detail where that Bailey is showing to reduce that thermal bridging. Next slide. Then we get into the ventilation. The building was what's called a dedicated outdoor air system. Basically, it provided ventilation through ductwork to all the spaces, and then completely separately and in parallel, it had these fan coils that provided heating and cooling to all the spaces. But it had no energy recovery on it. So basically, you got to you got to exhaust all the pollutants from the building. People are the #1 source of pollutants in most buildings, so we're mostly exhausting our smells, and we need to replace that with fresh outside air. And that costs, it's a lot of energy to heat and cool that air. But when the air is leaving the building, we can run it through a heat recovery ventilator up on the top right, and basically recover some of that heat and reduce the energy consumption of that ventilation. So we looked at a few different options, including glycol runaround loops. And if you go on to the next slide, we found a spot in the building. I think it's in the next slide. We found some spots on the building where there was a service room that wasn't used very much. It had good access to the existing ductwork, and we deemed it was possible to go through the walls and bring in fresh air and that exhaust air at each floor. So it's not one big large HRV for the building. It's about 12 of them on a per floor level, or two per floor. So that was something, again, looking at it, investigating the site, having the mechanical engineer look at it and go, yeah, this will fit in this space. We have access to the ductwork here, the existing ductwork here. We need a couple holes in the wall, but that can be dealt with. And it was something that was able to work out, and it was a realistic solution. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned, I mentioned our building was heated and cooled with local fan coils. The nice thing about local fan coils, if they're two-pipe fan coils, and they were, the coil inside is sized for cooling, which means it's oversized for heating. And that's important because when we go from the current boilers in the building to heat pumps, we're significantly changing the temperature of the hot water we're heating the building with. The old boilers were using 180 Fahrenheit water. The heat pumps today, air-to-water heat pumps today, only produce about 120 Fahrenheit. But because all these fan coils were sized for cooling and thus oversized for heating, they were compatible with 120 Fahrenheit. So this was a real lucky break for us on this building, because other buildings we would be looking at completely replacing all the terminal perimeter heating. But in this case, it was already compatible with it. So it was a really lucky break that controlled the cost of switching over to heat pumps. And then we're on the picture there, we're kind of showing, yeah, it does fit on the roof. We actually have drawings with the dimensions on it, but these heat pumps could fit on the roof. They could also fit in the backyard of the building there at the ground level as well. Next slide. And then we looked on to renewable energy and where we could put solar panels on the building. So all the places in red on the top of the building is places we can put the solar panels. And then we also even looked at the parking lot canopy, giving people some shade for their cars. It's kind of parking lots aren't well-used spaces in an urban context, or this is more suburban actually. So we're looking at putting some PV in the parkade there. Next slide. So here's a sum total of all these options. What's not shown on this chart is when these happen in time. But on the left is all of our options we can look at in the retrofit path. And on the right would be the business as usual. What if they weren't trying? If they were just going to replace like with everything, what would that be? So then we go on to the next slide. And that creates one of these roadmaps, as I mentioned, Sarah mentioned, different time frames. We know that we can do the air tightness now. We know that the current boiler plant and chiller plant is due for replacement in the 2030s, so we can do that in 2030. And in the 2040s, we looked at some other things like the roof upgrade, because the roof had lots of life in it. So all this is aligned when those things happen. There's a couple of these where we did look at that full envelope upgrade now. So remember we said to replace the windows to triple glaze glass, we'd have to replace the entire wall system as well. So we did look at that option, which is enclosure upgrade now, I think. Yeah. Anyways, the one we're showing is the path that was actually chosen, and we'll show you why in the next slide. So next slide. So here's some of the cash flow diagrams. There's more animation coming up, Bailey, so just click through a little bit. So what if we did the IG replacement now? It would save $40,000 a year. But if we did a full enclosure with the walls and the windows, it'd be $63,000 a year, but way more expensive. So the yellow line is what if we did the whole wall and the windows all at once, even though the walls don't need to be replaced yet, and do everything we can now. And you dig yourself, going down, that's the money you spend, and then the savings coming up, that's your savings over business as usual, the slope up. And you can see you by doing it all at once now, because the wall didn't need to be replaced yet, we really dug ourselves a big financial hole we're just not crawling out of. But if we looked at one of the top options, where we just let the current IG replacement go with just better performing double glazed windows, but not triples, do the air to water heat pump conversion in 2030, add the PV a bit later when the roof upgrades are happening, you can end up on one of these A1 or D1 paths that we don't completely come out of our hole. If we applied a carbon price, we probably would have. But electricity is more expensive in this market than natural gas was, so it made it a little bit challenging. Next slide. Oh, there we go. And we'll go on to the next slide. So after a lot of talking with the client, they actually chose that A1 path. It wasn't the best performing financial path. That would have been option D all the way to the right, but it is the path that got them closest to their goals. I didn't show it in these financial numbers, but I think the cost per ton of carbon saved was coming in around $70, $80 a ton. So that they thought was a reasonable carbon cost abatement price to pay to get to their goals. And that's the one they chose, was this A1, that we would do the air to water heat pump sooner rather than later, go with the current window replacement they were going through, do that air tightness right now, and then as the other systems need to be replaced, like the walls and the roof, doing those things when they needed to be done. Next slide. And that's all I had for this section, so we can stop for questions.
Thanks, Steve. All right, we've got some time, maybe 2 minutes or so for questions. Board Member Faruqi.
Thanks so much. This is super helpful. When you're thinking about the operational costs in 10, 20 years, are you factoring in changes in utility rates that far in the future? Okay.
Yeah.
My follow-up question, how are you modeling that, if you can share?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm not an economist. So, I mean, typically, if you're going to look at utility rates over a long time frame, it looks very much like general inflation. But in any 10-year time frame, it could be drastically different. This was a 40-year time frame, so it was, probably 2.5%. Of course, that was before things went crazy a year ago, but
All right, thanks, Steve. Any other questions?
This is Jack Nelson. I had to jump to my phone. Did you evaluate government or utility incentives that might help fund these projects?
For this particular project, the jurisdiction it was in had very little. We do have a carbon price. So in the jurisdiction that project was in, there was a carbon price, and we did include the carbon price. So that made things look better, but not perfect. Yeah. But whenever those things are available in a jurisdiction, absolutely, they need to be included.
I mean, the IRA is offering up to even 50% of geothermal if you're utilizing American-made components.
Yeah.
So it could have a significant impact.
Yeah.
Another thing I'd like to point out is that the fact that the building had fan coils that could utilize low temp water is huge.
Yeah.
Because the majority of buildings in Boston cannot heat the building with low temp water, and that retrofit is a major expense to
I completely agree, and that's
terminal devices.
Yeah, I completely agree, and before we got to the project, that one of the things I had in my head is if we can get the envelope perimeter losses down by 40–50%, you may not need to do the terminal heating, because when you go from 180 Fahrenheit to 120 Fahrenheit, you're basically losing 40–50% of your output capacity. But if we can equal that with heat loss, reduction in heat loss, your old stuff still works. Now, that doesn't mean the finances work. It just means it technically works. But that was one of the things that we were thinking of going into the project.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? Chairman Ellis, we'd like to ask, is it possible to get about 5 more minutes to wrap up the training today?
I think that should be fine, unless other board members have to jump off. I know the survey is particularly important for informing future sessions. So if board members are able to participate in the survey, then we can do that and then adjourn.
That sounds great. We've got the survey up on the screen here. You can use your phone to scan into the QR code. Alternatively, we can provide a link after this session if your mobile device is not available right now. I apologize, I don't have the link to that at the moment. But as a reminder, your responses today will help inform our design and development of future training materials. So that would be anything from our into our phase 2 training, which phase 2 and phase 3, which continues into November, as well as our up and coming cohort sessions, which occur next week and the week after. So we really appreciate your feedback. Few things to note on this survey that are different from last week. We do have a name requirement on this one, and that is purely to inform topics that, awesome. Thank you to Diana for dropping in that link to the chat in the chat there. We are asking for your name. That will inform content for the cohorts. So we know, who's responding to request which topics. So that's a little bit different. And then in terms of the cohort topics, it could be any of our previous session 1 topics, anything we talked about today in retrofit planning, or lots of potential future topics. PPAs and RECs have been a popular one that we have not yet gotten to, so we could start to kick off those sessions as well. District energy systems, combined heat and power, all of those topics are kind of up and coming, but we could kick those off early. All right, we'll give, while everyone wraps that up in consideration of time, I do want to share that I believe it was on Friday, the department circulated some information around how the review board can receive technical on-call support from RDH. So there's a few options there through either a written request form, so we can provide a written response to any questions that you might have. There's a link to that form to fill out, and then you'll receive a response through the corresponding log. Or there's an option to schedule on-call office hours with us, which are hosted on, I believe, the first Tuesday and third Thursday of each month. You can also do both. So the more information we have from you, the more helpful we can be in those office hour sessions. And those are available right now. So the form is live to receive support. And then our first session will kick off on July 18th. That's our first office hours session. We do ask that you register for those office hours to make sure that we maintain our threshold of individuals that can attend. Are there any questions from the review board about the on-call support service? No? Okay. You can feel free to reach out if you do have any questions. And then just a reminder, our cohort sessions do begin. The first session is on the 18th, and I believe the second session is on the 23rd. And then our phase 2 training will not begin until August. It kicks off in late August and then continues into September, but we are available through the on-call technical support service between now and then if you need anything. So thank you for your extra 6 minutes of time today. We had a lot of great discussion, and we appreciate everyone's questions and effort.
All right. Thank you, RDH, for your presentation today. Is there a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn?
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. On the motion to adjourn the meeting, board members in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, I believe the ayes have it, because board member Lattimore left earlier. So the motion passes. This meeting is adjourned at 6:37 p.m. Thank you all.
Have a good one, guys. Bye.
So much. Have a good one.